the parks, Mike and Daisy made the decision he is the young people's principal caregiver. Elephant and provided some support to assistants. With Mike's assistance, Daisy grew more happy and stopped resisting when the she played around when the workers tried to pet her, with them frequently using her trunk to limit their mobility, which results in everyone to erupt into laughs, because even if it's a friendly, she never got along with the other employees, completely warmed up to anybody. Besides, Mike served as Daisy's first friend, and an individual who rescued her while she was gradually withdrawing into the time they spent by themselves, ultimately working together, brought her happiness at Mike's capacity to connect with Daisy, received a lot of attention. And eventually, sanctuaries and wildlife parks with difficult creatures started to get to him for support. The focus was overwhelming, but he was appreciative of the opportunity to follow a dream of his, treasured for a very long period during his leisure. He offered advice to others. Focus, exploring methods in greater detail to enhance the behavior of animals, and building closer ties between humans and animals' caregivers. In spite of his developing obligations to which Mike stayed committed, he is positioned at the park without. Regardless of how busy his day was, he always worked to make time for Daisy and cultivate her connection with the other elephants that were saved and added to the Mike matured beside Daisy in the park as she grew. Met her and stayed with her for 30. Nearly everyone is 31 years old. Had forgotten Daisy's difficult past. Her cheerful disposition and affection for her visitors and caregivers made her the park's main point of interest and a major source of joy for many people. Nowadays, Mike, who was 53 years old, had accomplished more than he anticipated and participated in important initiatives pertaining to animals' preservation, even if he relished. His Mike was prepared to leave his job at the park and take more trips overseas to keep supporting the preservation of wildlife over the globe, as he and Daisy had a close relationship and thought that his helper might carry on with his job. Alongside her, when he decided to, Mike began cutting back on the quantity after leaving. Spent his time with her in the hopes that would enable her to distance herself from it was sorry to see him leave the park. Attempted to keep him, but a month later, after his resignation was approved, he was permitted to depart before departing. He entered the enclosure and said, "Goodbye, Daisy. I'm so happy to see him." Appeared much more eager to play with Mike rather than focusing on what he said. Unable to get her attention, he decided to engage and play with her rather than enjoying when it was time to leave. He did so, silently wishing she wouldn't know he was absent. But Daisy was wrapping her trunk. Mike realized how mistaken he was around him. What can happen when familiar caregivers are lost? Elephants to get down and decline to eat. Elephants have amazing recollections, and they find it difficult to forget a person who had looked after them for so long. Mike was depressed about having to put her through a challenging circumstance in spite of all the time he spent with her. He was still unable to predict how she would respond. When he left to Daisy, his disappearance had come as a shock, and she was unable to comprehend that she might not see him ever again, encircled him with her trunk, and declined to relax and take laps from the Daisy, the staff member, instantly became happier, and she maintained her even as she moved. Mike's trunk to prevent him from separating from her too much, although, fortunately, he had no intention of departing. When he discovered she was all right, Mike, when it came time to feed her, assumed leadership once more, and moreover provided. In order to fill her with joy, she would water spray from her trunk, resulting in Mike to flee in laughter. During the he stayed by her side all day until he went back home under Mike's supervision. Daisy recovered her strength gradually and spirit, and in acknowledgement of his commitment, the park gave him the position of the management to motivate him to remain. The new job offered flexible hours, permitting Mike to stay near Daisy and the other creatures with whom he had developed a bond. When he was a Mike, the caregiver agreed to the offer, and since he was no longer in charge of Daisy's care and failed to see her each day, he kept making time for her at any moment when could Daisy soon welcome her calf, Own, and the initial action she took was present it to. It was evident to Mike that the proud elephant mom wanted to do more than just brag. Her calf, but desired for it to form a connection. She had a strong relationship with the same person. Relationship with whatever transpired. Daisy would always remember the Mike's warmth and love demonstrated to her when she most needed it. She felt caregivers, and form a connection with them. Ability to establish a deep connection with they was necessary to stop her from sensation secluded. But Mike didn't completely understand the difficulty of the task until he discovered himself standing directly in front of Daisy, would only react when fed. The character's offer and would retreat whenever someone attempted to touch her. Attempts to get her to play were futile, as she would remain still on the floor, pretending that they don't cease to exist. When Mike tried to approach her, she had a negative reaction. Seeing him as someone she had never met and became even less trusting of him more than the others each day, Mike. When he arrived, he saw the same resistance that merely revealed the depth of Daisy was wounded by the death of Mike, spent his leisure time with her mother, perused literature and sought guidance from a few of his wildlife specialists before reaching the park. But he was unable to make Daisy Mike understood that he had to accept him, demonstrate to her daily how much he'd taken care of her a month following the time he was presented to Mike, the elephant, and the caregiver reached the elephant. Enclosure, bringing Daisy's food she consumed and then went on to wait for her patiently while lying down. Caretakers should go rather than walk Mike, go with the rest of the staff. Requested to remain. This was his final assignment for the day, and he desired to spend some additional. Just a few minutes before his return home, he was granted authorization to continue and discovered a log to perch on. Elephants are sympathetic, just like us. Entities with the ability to hear, and Mike meant to interpret human voices. To depend on Daisy's innate capacity to sense feelings, to establish a connection with her, and gently remove the obstacles she had constructed around. He started talking to her about his day and the events that took place. There was no one near the animal park. Approach to his insanity, and he discussed everything that came into contact with his Mike, took note of Daisy's ears. She became alert upon hearing his chuckle. But aside from that, she provided no obvious indications that she had heard him following a little more than 30 minutes. Speaking, he bid farewell and left. Days home. But this was going to be the first of many exchanges. After he finished the etu, the day he went back to Daisy, he would, before leaving for home, spend some time with her. He was always the one to take the bath. Her and made it a moment in which both of them may discover more about one another. Other and construct days of trust grew into weeks, and soon Mike started to observe the outcome of all his hard labor. I apologize for the disruption prior to moving forward with the story. I respectfully request that you enjoy the video and follow this channel. It's really very significant to us. Many thanks. observed that Daisy had begun to expect his visits at the conclusion of each day. Her ears pricked up with anticipation. She would observe him every time he spoke, carefully displaying an increasing level of interest, and bath time during her engagement had also turned into her favorite moment of the day, when she was quite helpful to her. Caretakers. Mike came back one evening. To the elephant again enclosure. It had been a long day, and he wanted to head in all directions. Back at home instantly, but he and Daisy had previously made this their custom, and he didn't have any intending to miss it. He intended to only remain for a short while, and he apologized for having to go, but when he arrived, he was welcomed by a first-time surprising sight. Daisy was getting up and moving around, awaiting him upon his arrival, and as he took a seat and she came up to him, carefully and paid attention to him as he continued talking about his day and how shocked he was. He was to observe the modifications in her, but the moment for him eventually arrived. To go, but before he could circle back, Daisy wrapped her trunk and left, pulled at him as he wrapped it around his arm. Mike couldn't help but stare down at her, the broad grin that appeared on his face. It had been almost 3 months since he initially encountered her, but this was the first. She had extended her hand to touch Mike, was extremely humbled to acknowledge that he was the initial recipient of her affection and trust. His weariness dissipated into the background while he bent over to tenderly pet. Daisy didn't pull away this time. Rather, she grasped his hand, confident that he would not abandon her. After Mike told the management and his manager what had transpired. Until they saw it for themselves, one believed him. Themselves when he uttered her name. When he leaned, Daisy ran to him. She nuzzled him down to pet her, displaying love and sincerity, joy that she hadn't displayed in a lengthy time, observing the strengthening relationship between. This elephant refused to eat for weeks and weep every day at the zoo for her caregivers, were perplexed and unable to identify the cause for this sudden change in her conduct. Then, a well-known person reappeared. His arrival at the zoo altered anything we can do to support her. It was this query that troubled the daily zookeepers during the previous month. Daisy the elephant appeared too unconcerned, hardly conscious of her surrounds. All indications pointed to she may be running out of time. Daisy was more than simply she was the pride and joy of the elephant. The wildlife park, which is a popular Daisy, was one of several people who they considered her to be a friend, transported at a very young age into the park age, and the majority of those present had watched as she developed from a calf into what Daisy was typically cheerful today, and would occasionally do PR annex on the employees to prevent them from abandoning her to care for other creatures. Elephants are sophisticated and perceptive creatures with emotionally rich life, and witnessing her it was wonderful to feel so happy and loved. Appealing to the kind-hearted zookeepers, but all of the most days, she stopped eating or take a couple nibbles of anything you want to drink. After a long time, this was really unusual for coaxing, an animal that formerly enthusiastically ate every one of her dinners. The look in her eyes frequently expressed a great deal of sadness and an intense feeling of a few zookeepers also suffered a loss, observed her weeping unexpectedly, and are currently attempting to determine what had occurred. They needed to take action, or otherwise Daisy would eventually get caught in a cavernous gorge that it would come from. She is nearly impossible to lift. Out, the consequences would be severe. She may even choose to withdraw into solitude and die of starvation. The caregivers acknowledged that they didn't possess the necessary skills to aid in her recovery, and the manager stretched out in his despair. To a longtime friend named Mike, requesting his daily assistance brought her one step closer to the edge, and nobody else was there. Somebody who could provide Daisy with the friend agreed to provide the help she needed. To come, and after 2 days, he reached the zoo. He was an experienced expert, addressing wildlife in particular. By the time he got there, the elephants won. And Iota's circumstances remained unchanged. Daisy didn't move from her listless enclosure that shows little interest in Mike said softly, "It's me, Food Daisy." He approached her warily. "But why are you giving them a lot of trouble?" inquired once more in a soft voice. Daisy's ears perked up out of nowhere, and she swiftly raised her head in the direction of the recognizable voice that her extended fast had left her weak. But she recovered to stand up and go cautiously. This was the person she had toward him. Been anticipating, because as she approached him, Mike couldn't resist recalling the first time he ever spoke with. At the age of 1, Daisy had been taken to the wildlife park, an orphan, and the death of, at such an early age, her mother had made Daisy was a little cautious and bashful. She had no desire to connect with any of her caregivers, and would frequently stay away from the contact of people she thought were accountable for her mother's vanished, as she attempted to adapt to her new surroundings at the park. Choose to enlist a new assistant. Mike, who was 24 years old, had begun as a volunteer. However, he was not planning to remain in that role, for long-term animal care was a dream that Mike had always had. Himself, while he was eager to collaborate with a variety of animals, Mike was really passionate about for wildly. He has always read about conservation and watched the fight to protect. These creatures persisted in living in our. He sought to battle the ever-changing world. For these creatures, without a voice of own, and desired to leave his mark in that space, having an opportunity to function as the wildlife park volunteer, was a dream come true. Indeed, this was his very first assignment, and he hoped he would prove himself shortly. As a benefit, and possibly receive a complete job opening from the park shortly after getting accepted on board, Mike was given the responsibility of working as an assistant to a caregiver. He was informed regarding Daisy, and the parks had a hard time getting her to leave her shell ever since she was taken there. Daisy's mom was murdered by poachers, and she had such a young, experienced psychological distress Consequently, their team's objective was to assist her in feeling secure in her new surroundings and win Daisy's trust in the